Welcome to the Uplevel Dairy Podcast, the podcast for dairy farm owners, managers, and advisors who are committed to profitability, sustainability, and excellence. I'm your host, Peggy Coffeen, and it's my mission to bring you the conversations that will uplevel your skill set and your mindset so you can be a top performer in the dairy farming business. And that's why I'm excited to share with you a new edition here today on the Uplevel Dairy Podcast, a monthly market update designed to empower you to make informed decisions for your dairy farming business. We are partnering with HighGround Dairy. HighGround Dairy provides global dairy market intelligence, insurance services, futures and options brokerage, and advisory programs to a diverse range of dairy market participants throughout the supply chain. You can look forward to the January update on our very next episode, but today I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to Curtis Bosma, Vice President of Producer Services for HighGround Dairy. Curtis Bosma, you will be a familiar voice here in the next 12 months on the Uplevel Dairy Podcast, providing monthly market updates on behalf of HighGround Dairy. But you're not just a risk management guy who's never got mud on his boots. Tell me how dairy farming has been a part of your life for a really long time.
Yeah, so like a lot of dairy families out here in California, my grandparents immigrated from the Netherlands to Southern California in the late 80s. My family moved up from the Southern California area to the Central Valley, where I grew up on a dairy in Tipton, California, Tulare County. My family also owned and operated a dairy in Northwest Illinois that they started in the early 2000s. In 2019, my dad and uncle, who were partners on both of those dairies, sold those dairies. The barns have kind of gotten to that point where it was time for some upgrades, and I was too excited doing what I'm doing now to want to come back and run the family dairies. But now my family has some almond trees and commercial real estate to keep them plenty busy. But I still have extended family that's currently operating dairies in about a dozen U.S. states.
Wow. So dairy has very much been a part of your life, and you have experience not only in the West in California, but also some dairy experience coming from the Midwest. And so I'm curious for you, Curtis, when you look back on your days of being boots on the ground in dairy, what was your chore? Did you have any specific jobs that tended to be yours on the farm?
I feel like I kind of, grew up with the cows. So, when I first started in the dairy, we actually raised our own calves. So my first job was always feeding calves and kind of with a lot of the young stock there. Then got a little bit more involved with the heifer program. And then by the time I was, older and middle school and high school and stuff, was kind of doing regular outside work that, most dairy kids are very familiar with.
So you got to do your fair share of chores. And so when you think about having been in dairy your whole life, what are a couple of the big lessons that you really take away from having grown up in the industry?
Yeah, I mean, obviously hard work and developing a work ethic is something that I think is incredibly unique to, any kid that grows up in, a farming background. And that's something we've tried to kind of implement with our team here at HighGround when looking at, potential new hires. Work ethic is a big thing. Another big thing that always sticks out to me is just general respect, whether that's for, the cows themselves, employees, equipment, family, having that sense of respect of, there's a lot of amazing things going on every single dairy operation. Being able to kind of appreciate that and take it for what it is.
Yeah, so that hard work, that respect, definitely things that many of us that grew up in dairy and continue to be in dairy can relate to. And you talked about your family history in the dairy business, and somewhere along the way, you chose to go down this path of risk management. So how did you get into that?
Yeah, so I would say it wasn't an accident. If you look at the timeline of my life of, what was happening in the dairy markets versus what was happening on the farm, it makes sense as to why I'm here today. I left for college shortly after 2009, which, as many of us remember, was one of the worst years financially the industry has ever had to endure. So when I went off to college, I didn't want to go, the traditional ag business or dairy science route. So I went and got a degree in finance and economics. But after realizing that was either going to land me a job at a bank or something like that, I was kind of still determined to work, somewhat in the dairy industry in some kind of capacity. So the summer before my senior year, I had the opportunity to work with a group out of Chicago that was trading some, dairy futures and options at the CME. Right away, I kind of knew that was the perfect combination of, financial markets, strategic planning, and working with, dairy farmers, which is ultimately what I wanted to do. So I had my senior year to kind of look at all the different firms that were out there in that sort of space. I joined the HighGround Dairy team shortly after college. So spent 8 years working and living in downtown Chicago, kind of working remotely with dairy producers across the U.S. And then just over like a year and a half ago, I moved out to Central California here. I'm actually living in Visalia, so just a little bit north of where I grew up in Tipton. And working with dairy producers still kind of all over the U.S., but we're kind of putting a little bit more of a local touch on things. It's very nice to be able to sit down and have a cup of coffee with dairy producers versus just having Zoom meetings and talking over the phone and such.
Curtis, one of the things that I think is really interesting about your path is the time that you did spend being boots on the ground in Chicago at the CME. And so what was that like to be in the intensity of the trading game, like to be right there on the floor and in the action?
So, when you watch movies like Trading Places and things like that, you kind of get this depiction of this exciting physical trading environment. To be honest, as I kind of came onto the scene in the industry, all that sort of went away. A lot of it now is done electronically, so there's a lot less excitement, screaming and shouting and stuff going on. But I still got to kind of sample a little bit of some of that going on as I first kind of entered the business a little bit to see, how the CME spot market functions on a daily basis and such. But it's really fascinating to kind of see, how all these dairy companies come together in a, marketplace like that. On the one hand, doing price discovery, so figuring out what are the prices for all these core commodities that make up, your milk prices going to be. But then on the other hand, figuring out creative and strategic ways to transfer risk by putting on all sorts of positions and things like that. So it was definitely a fun experience, and it's something that, I'm glad I have, because now I can go out and talk with dairy producers and educate them, not as someone that read it out of a textbook, but as someone that kind of experienced it firsthand.
You understand the dairy side, and that's very personal to you, and you understand the side of being right there and seeing how the markets, how they react, and looking at the strategies around that. And so in that experience that you've had, Curtis, of really diving deep into markets and strategy and studying these trends for years now, what is it that surprised you most?
I think since risk management and hedging and all these different sorts of strategic things are a little bit of a newer thing in the dairy industry, a lot of people see them as sort of, optional things. Some dairies need to do that, some dairies don't. But when you look at other commodities that are out there, and then I think specifically of, the grain markets with corn, for example, every year we plant corn, we harvest corn in the U.S., and you look at the actual total futures trading volume, well, we actually trade more in volume of the corn futures contract than what we actually produce. And I think the multiple, it ranges year to year, but it's, definitely a multiple of what we actually produce. When you look at dairy, we're only trading about 20 to 30% of the physical volume of dairy commodities using futures and options every year. That continues to grow every year. We've seen a lot of impressive growth in recent years. But I think the thing to think about is the dairy commodities only have like a 20 to 30 year history, whereas the other commodities have been trading for well over 100 years. So the roadmap of how supply chains are going to interact with risk management tools and how things are going to go is there. We are still a little bit in the infancy of implementing a lot of those things in terms of everybody in the supply chain using these tools. But it's pretty amazing to think about if we were to go from that 20, 30% to 100% of the total U.S. dairy supply being traded in futures and options. That's nearly 5x growth in this industry we're talking about.
You've been studying these trends, and you have this in-depth knowledge, Curtis, of not just dairy, but other commodities and what that looks like in this risk management space. And so you are going to be joining us monthly to give us a market update, but also to educate and inform and truly empower our listeners of Uplevel Dairy Podcast when it comes to risk management, protecting their margin, and being able to be profitable and sustainable dairy farming businesses. So just give us a little sneak peek. What can listeners expect to hear from you every month?
We're looking forward to plugging in some market intelligence and being able to share kind of some trends of things going on in the markets. We'll definitely talk about some, broad-based things. We'll have a couple of like sort of educational things. And yeah, I mean, if there's anything that I'm explaining in any of these episodes, anybody has any questions, I love to make sure that we're connecting and educating the industry on all the things going on with, milk pricing and risk management and all the great stuff.
Yeah, so we'll make sure that every episode that there are links in the show notes for people to find that information to contact you directly, Curtis, to ask some of those questions. And you'll also be offering some resources from that market intelligence standpoint to really, like we talked about, inform and empower dairy producers to make good financial decisions. And so, Curtis, HighGround Dairy, you've been with this company, as you said, for several years. And so what do you do differently?
One thing, especially on the producer side of our business that we put a lot of focus on, is kind of making sure we value the relationships in the community that we have with, a lot of these producers. I mean, I always think it's most important. Like if I think of my own life, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a friend, and sometimes I happen to help people solve these complex problems with dairy risk management as well. I think it's important for everyone to have that sort of order of operations in their life and being a part of a community. I think there's a lot of other businesses in our space that have big sales teams. They're all located in Chicago or have some big office somewhere else. And, that's great. But if you aren't talking to someone that speaks the same language as you or understands your, unique situation, it can sometimes lose a lot of things in translation when you're trying to, work with someone like that.
So Curtis, we talked about HighGround Dairy. We talked about your background, but I want to go a little bit deeper. And some of our listeners know that I have 5 questions that I really, really love to ask our guests. So I'm going to ask you the Uplevel 5. These are 5 questions that are really just to get to know more about you, who you are, how you operate, why you do what you do. And so the first question that I have for you today is this. Curtis, what does success look like to you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I know there's a lot of ways I could answer this. I try to really distill it down, when thinking about success, thinking about what's most valuable to us and what's the most valuable thing we have to offer. And the most valuable thing that we all have is our time. So I look a lot of, how that time gets spent. There's different, kind of value buckets that we have out there that we want to put our time towards, whether that's family, friends, community, church, finance, other things like that. And success to me is having kind of a disciplined approach to how we distribute that time and making sure that there's not very much time that ends up being wasted in that distribution.
Okay, so that is a fantastic answer. And it reminds me actually a lot of what Tommy Ursh and I from Swiss Lane Farms have talked about on this podcast before, those buckets, right? And how we divvy up our time and what we put into each of those buckets. And so what does that look like for you?
Yeah, so obviously family is a big thing for me, being able to be around here. I've some family members that live in California, so being able to be around them on a regular basis and not being out in Chicago is great. Being a member of community, being able to contribute to our local church here, not only in time, but in other capacities as well, it is great. So yeah, I think just the main thing for me is making sure none of that time gets wasted, because I think a lot of people end up, forgetting where those buckets are, and then you just kind of go chasing butterflies and wasting time.
Ooh, so extreme focus on those buckets and time management. And that leads into my next question for you. In 3 words, how do you want to show up each day?
So I'll steal a concept here from a book called Atomic Habits, which you may have heard of before, but by 3 words would be 1% better. In that book, they talk a lot about compounding power of habits there. And they kind of always circle back to the example of if you have a starting value of 1 and you increase that by 1% every day for a year, because of that compounding effect, you end up with a number that's 37.7. Whereas if you start at the number of 1 and you get 1% worse every single day for a year, you end up at 0.03. So I think, yeah, there is a compounding effect to being 1% better every day and kind of gaining that momentum over time.
Yeah. Okay. So you just demonstrated, as you talked about before, your aptitudes for strategy and statistics in that answer. Can you make it real for us? Is there a habit that you have been working on developing or taking away from your daily life in the last year or two?
Yeah. So a big thing that I've been trying to kind of implement over the past couple of months is more of a strict workout routine. It's not that I do anything that's rocket science or anything crazy like that, but I think it's very good to get the heart rate up on a consistent basis and make sure that you're staying active and such, especially now not being on the farm where getting 10,000 steps a day was very easy to do when you're on the dairy, but sitting in front of a desk most of the day, you got to make sure you stay active.
I hear you, Curtis. I hear you. Okay. What's your favorite workout?
I have a exercise bike at home, one of those Echo bikes, and I swear I think 20 minutes on that thing will beat you up pretty hard. So
there we go. And that's efficiency, right? Strategic efficiency. Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that example of not just how you talk the talk, but how you're walking the walk or biking the walk in that case. And question number 3, who are some of the thought leaders that you follow?
Again, kind of a stats and numbers nerd. So I really like a lot of the books from Nassim Taleb, he has the book, The Black Swan, Fooled by Randomness, Skin in the Game. He's also a former options trader. So it's a lot of the same trading and finance language that I'm sort of into as well. But he has a lot of very good insights and kind of distilling down different socioeconomic trends and stuff like that. I also enjoy reading all the books from Malcolm Gladwell, like Outliers, Tipping Point, things like that. Those are always fascinating reads to kind of, take a look at things that are going on from a bit of a different perspective. And then lastly, I would say Andrew Huberman, which I don't know if that's a common response on this podcast, but a bit of a health nerd and gets a lot of interesting insights on getting your daily sunlight, exercise, things like that. I will say I don't follow all of his daily routines 100% to a T, but definitely I think it's an interesting follow for anyone that hasn't heard of him.
And that's Huberman Lab Podcast. Yeah, it'll take up a little bit bigger chunk of your day than Uplevel Dairy Podcast. But if you're looking for a good hour or more to plug into it, really some deep science and physiology, it's one that I'll pop on in the morning sometimes when I'm doing my workouts too. And it's enlightening to get that deeper understanding of our physical health, which I think is super important for our dairy community, but even more important for people like you and I, Curtis, that are no longer getting in our activity, like our friends that are out there working and doing the thing every day on the farm. Question number 4 that I have for you: what words do you live by?
Yeah, for anyone that's had the opportunity to talk with me on the phone, you probably heard me say all of these things quite often, but I do have like 4 things that I feel like I repeat on a very frequent basis. One would be the best activity is proactivity. So in a lot of cases, you'll talk with people that are trying to manage their margins or do something with risk management, and they kind of wait until the last second. We saw a lot of this happen, in 2020 and in Q2 when markets were kind of in free fall. At that point, if you were looking for some form of coverage, you were essentially buying fire insurance on a burning building. And so that's why we always are making sure people are aware of, hey, there's a lot of advantage in being proactive in this stuff. The second one I definitely say a lot is don't be a price taker. I see a lot of dairy producers on social media or different outlets that are kind of saying, hey, this milk price isn't fair, we're not making money here. And that happens. And that's, it is unfortunate and it is frustrating to be faced with those challenges. But there are tools out there for dairy producers to mitigate some of those problems and take advantage of what prices might be ahead of time a little bit. So if you're just sitting back and letting the market do what it's going to do, unfortunately, markets are volatile. If you're taking that price and not being proactive about it, it puts you in a very difficult position occasionally.
These are things we'll probably be talking about a lot in the next 12 months.
Absolutely. Third one I have here is hope is not a strategy. Whenever we, get into some dire situations in the market, a lot of people kind of get down on themselves and kind of say, well, I hope things will get better. I hope things will turn around and we'll get back to where things ought to be. That is not a strategic approach to finance. I hope that we all work out, very well in our businesses and such, but we do need to apply some strategy to how we look forward at these things.
So hope, a necessity, but not a strategy.
Yeah. We need something to get out of bed every morning. We can't be all doom and gloom in this business.
Good words to live by. And question number 5, the last of my Uplevel 5, to get to know you a little bit better, Curtis, is this. What's your next personal uplevel, that area of your life that you are turning up a notch in 2024?
Yeah, so I have a couple on the board this year for 2024. One of them is growing the team, and that falls into 2 categories, really. I think one is internally. We're always looking for ways to be learning new things, whether that's from clients or other industry allies, about how we can be improving. I think the risk management and financial side of our industry has done a really good job at running ahead and solving big problems and putting together the toolkit for dairy producers to use. But there still is, a bit of a knowledge gap out there in terms of how to strategically use those tools versus how people are potentially kind of using them day to day. So that's definitely one way we're looking at things in terms of growing. Another thing is just externally. So we're always looking for people that are passionate about producer success and dairy, and seeing if they might be, a good fit for the HighGround team.
Yeah. So growth is the uplevel in 2024.
Yeah, and making some investments in technology this year as well. So just kind of other ways of improving how we deliver value to dairy producers. So stay tuned for more on that. I would say my only personal thing I kind of have on my board for 2024 is to get my golf handicap down into the single digits. I've been hovering around a 10 handicap for a while now, and I think I'm getting close to the single digits here, hopefully.
So this is a big year ahead for you personally and professionally in 2024.
It has been helpful living in a climate where you can golf year round. The seasonal golf that I had for 12 plus years of living in the Midwest definitely stalled out my golf game a little bit, I think.
So you talked before about atomic habits, getting 1% better every day, about strategy. What's the game plan for improving your golf handicap?
Just banging balls. I think a lot of golfers watch YouTube videos on how to adjust their swing and how to do stuff. But at the end of the day, I think it's just a numbers game. You just got to hit a bunch of balls.
And that's your statistician side showing through there, and your dairy farmer kid side. Show up, do the work, and get 1% better every day by doing the thing.
That's the goal.
Well, Curtis, we are excited to have you sharing your knowledge, your insights, and I'm going to be pushing you for some updates throughout the year on these goals that you have as well. So look forward to hearing more on Curtis's golf game throughout 2024 here on the Uplevel Dairy Podcast. And if anyone would like to reach out to you or start following some of the things that HighGround Dairy is doing, we'll have all of those links in our show notes. What's the best way for people to reach you, Curtis?
You can reach us by emailing info@highgrounddairy.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us on the Uplevel Dairy Podcast, and we will hear from you again very soon. Find the links in our show notes to contact Curtis and HighGround Dairy, and look forward to our next episode for monthly market insights. HighGround Dairy provides global dairy market intelligence, insurance services, futures and options brokerage, and advisory programs to a diverse range of dairy market participants throughout the supply chain. And if you want to get to know another member of the HighGround Dairy team, head back to our last episode where we featured young dairy leader Alex Gamboni. Thank you for listening to the Uplevel Dairy Podcast. And if you like what you've heard today, or if there's more you want to hear on the Uplevel Dairy Podcast to serve you, go ahead and shoot me an email to Peggy@upleveldairy.com. This is Peggy Coffeen, and thank you for listening to the Uplevel Dairy Podcast.